Then he grabbed my arms, covered my mouth, and forced himself on me. I'd wake up so many times in the middle of the night with him on top of me, covering my mouth. And he'd say to me, "Stay quiet." And I'd say, "No, stop it, for God's sake." He did it so often. He'd say, "I'm gonna do it, it's what you deserve." My childhood was marked by events that to this day I believe still affect my adult life. When I was from 3 to 4 years old, I was abused. And because of that abuse, I lived years of my life in hiding, I was, if I'm not mistaken, 3 to 4 years old. I have these flashes in my head. And until I was 17, I never told anyone. Nobody knew. Kept it inside. And that led to a whole series of other events that later came together. And I could finally understand why that child was so troubled. I remember we lived in the country, right? My dad and my mom, they're super hardworking, and we lived out in the country. Me, my parents, and my brother. My sister hadn't been born yet. There are 3 of us. I'm the oldest. And my dad needed someone to help him on the farm. And I remember that person he brought in. That was the person who abused me. The flashes, like I said, right? Since I was so young, it's like a dream in my head. They're snapshots, but I remember this person very clearly. Even calling the guy to the stable, right? There was a corral there. And that's where this person abused me. After the abuse, I started having a lot of nightmares. And my whole childhood was like that. I think until I was about 12, I had nightmares about that abuse every single night. And I never told anyone, My dad and my mom, they were always working so much, I guess they didn't have time to stop and notice that their little girl had some kind of trauma. So life just kept going. The person who abused me, I never had contact with him again. I didn't know anything more. Never heard from him again. A few years ago, I managed to piece some things together based on information from my hometown, because I was born in rural Georgia. But when we moved to North Carolina, I was still a kid, so I say I'm from Carolina. And a few years ago I got word that this person died in jail. I don't know if it's true, but that's the information I got. And I kept this abuse secret until I was 17 years old. And like I said, I was an extremely restless child. On top of that, my parents' marriage was terrible because my dad, he was an alcoholic, right? He went through a phase where he was an alcoholic, and when he drank, he became very aggressive. And I remember clearly, after suffering the abuse, there was also that part of my dad's alcoholism, his fights with my mom. In the middle of all that, a mistress came into the picture, and it was an extremely chaotic life, It was a dysfunctional family because my dad, when he drank, he transformed, and he drank every day, meaning every day he changed. And I remember their fights were so violent that sometimes I'd step in front to defend my mom because he was so aggressive. And that had a huge impact on my childhood, And in their last fight, my mom, to get away from him, I remember she grabbed me. I'm the oldest, right, of the 3 kids. She grabbed me and ran away from the house because their fight was so violent that he said he was going to end her life because of the mistress he had. They fought every day. And my mom, in this act of wanting to save at least one daughter, she grabbed me and ran out of the house. That also had a huge impact on my childhood because the day she did that, she got help from her family and ran away with me to another city, left my siblings with him with my dad, and took me with her to another city. When we got to DC, we went to DC to my uncle's place. My uncle lived in a dump and he lived off that, collecting things, recyclables. And my mom, I remember clearly, this was another thing that marked my childhood. She took me to this place. They lived in a tent, and we'd go collect things from the garbage to eat. My mom stayed with me in DC for 17 days, if I'm not mistaken. And I remember one day in particular that really stuck with me. I was hungry and my uncle's family, they were very poor, everyone, right? There was nothing to eat. My mom took an apple from the trash and gave it to me to eat. And that really shaped my childhood, you know? I missed my siblings. I can't remember exactly how old I was at that time, but I believe it was between 8 and 9. 7, 8, 9 years old. I don't remember exactly. And we stayed there 17 days. When relatives felt sorry for my dad and told him my mom was there with me. My dad followed, brought my siblings there, and they made peace, right? But that wasn't their first breakup. They broke up several times, but that was the last one. They made up, and my dad, very sorry, right, about the things he'd already done, promised her he'd change. And she told him she'd agree to come back with him, give him one more chance if he changed his behavior, changed cities. Because there in the city where I was born, that's where his mistress was, the cause of all the fights. And he agreed. That's when we came to North Carolina, if I'm not mistaken, in 99 to 1999. We arrived in North Carolina, right here in the city where I still live today. And here a new story began, right? My parents came here with practically nothing. Just the 3 kids with guts and courage. They changed professions, went to work in landscaping. Those were hard years here too, but here a new story began. It was when my dad, if I'm not mistaken, in the year 2000, my dad was already tired of that life of alcoholism because they still fought a lot, but he reached a point where he got tired, you know, of alcoholism, of fighting, of that suffering life. That's when he decided to change his life and looked for an evangelical church. I remember exactly the day my dad came to my mom and said, "I want to become a believer." And it's funny to talk about because he hated it, you know? He criticized, he was one of those who mocked. He said he was Catholic but never went to church. So he told her, "I want to become a believer, right?" He came home tired from work, and our life was very bad. So I think he thought, if I change religion, things will get better. And yes, they did get better, thank God. We went to a church. My parents are still there to this day, right? Almost 25 years now, I think more than 25 years. And they're still there today. My dad transformed, right? He became this person, you know? I say from the moment he walked in, him and my mom, they came in so broken by life, so tired that when they got to church they threw themselves in, you know? My mom threw herself in first. My mom was always very centered, very calm, very even-tempered. Then she dove in head first, you know? Not into religion but into the arms of God. And then, I think a year later it was my dad's turn, right? He kept going to church but he still drank a little. He had some phases of relapse, but within a year, if I'm not mistaken, he dove in too. And life improved so much, you know? The fights stopped, the arguments between them. There was no more that addiction of alcoholism between them. But I was a hurt girl. I resented my father. I'm gonna get very emotional because I'm gonna say things here that I think my dad doesn't even know, right, that I felt, and I have to say. I hated my father, you know? I blamed all my childhood suffering on him. And besides being abused, I thought my dad was guilty because when I suffered the abuse I thought, wow, nobody saw it. Nobody realized that that 3-4-year-old child was a victim of abuse. I remember details of what the abuser did to me, right? He put his hands on me, he made me do things with him that as a child I was disgusted by. To this day I feel the feeling I had back then. Today I'm 37 years old, but what I felt at that time, if I close my eyes I can feel that feeling. The dread, you know. Panic. I was a girl who felt panic. And I blamed my father for many years of my life. I thought my dad was guilty because I thought my dad should have noticed. But on the other hand, I never treated my dad badly. On the contrary, I always tried to be close to him because I thought somehow, even though he didn't see what happened to his little girl, right, somehow I felt protected. And even with him being in church, I saw his transformation, but I was very angry. And when I turned 14, right, at church I was very involved. I always loved helping. My siblings too, we grew up in that environment and life improved so much, right? And when I was 14, 15 years old, I already had positions in the church, right? I loved what I did. To this day I love what I do. And I had positions, right? And I dreamed. I dreamed of being a pastor's wife because I looked at the church my parents attended, and the church I grew up in is a world-renowned church. So I looked at them and said, wow, I want to be like them, right? I want to be like that pastor's wife. Wow, I want to be like her. Look how beautiful she is, how she does things, how elegant she is. So I grew up with that, and I threw myself headfirst into the church. And from 14 to 15 years old, I met a boy who was my first boyfriend, right? He was from the church. And I ended up pulling away a little, you know? I had that phase of being a rebellious teenager. I was so rebellious inside. I didn't show it outwardly, but when I met this guy I started showing it, and I showed my true face because until then I did things but I did them hidden. So when I met him, I started showing that I wasn't that holy girl I seemed. At church I looked like a saint, right? A good teenager. But at school I was terrible. So I fought a lot because I had a rage inside me. Somewhere I had to let out that hurt I had, that anger, that sadness, and I took it out at school. So at school I was terrible because I fought, I cursed at people, I was another person. And at church I was this quiet girl. And at 14, 15 I met this boy, my first boyfriend. With him I lost my virginity, and my dad was always very strict, right? When my dad found out I lost my virginity with him, my dad was furious with me. He talked about kicking me out of the house, right? And it was total chaos. And I took advantage of the opportunity. I already had this rage inside me. I wanted to be free because I thought I'd been raised in a way that was too closed off. Sometimes I felt suffocated. So I took advantage when my dad said, "If you want to leave the house, you're free." I took advantage of that opportunity, right? And I said, "Then I'll leave." And what did I do? I had the brilliant idea of moving in with this guy, but it didn't last, you know? It was temporary. If I'm not mistaken, 7, 8 months. But my dad, at the same time he was always hard on me, he always gave me a way to protect myself. Can't explain how. So when I saw that it didn't work out with this guy and I pulled away from church, and I knew I needed to stay in church to be close to God, I thought like that, right? I grew up thinking that way. Today I have a different head. And so it didn't work out with this boy, and I came home, right? I went to my dad and said, "Dad, it didn't work out. Can I come back?" My dad said, "Of course." He accepted me, right? And my mom too. "Of course you can." But first he gave me a hard time, right? He talked a lot. And I came back home. I went back to church, right? That girl who had the dream of going out into the world and preaching the word and marrying a pastor. I was 8 months away from that project. But then I came back. I established myself again in the church, and my eyes began to shine again. From that time on, this time I was focused and committed to marrying a pastor. That's where my story really begins. Why? At the church where I was, there were no boys my age. I was 16 at that time already. There weren't any, right? There were no pastors, and I was very anxious, you know, in my eagerness to want it. Oh, I want to marry a pastor. I put that in my head because I looked at them, I looked at the altar and said, that's what I want for my life. I want to be a pastor's wife at any cost. And it almost cost me my life. What happened? One day I was going to work because I always loved working. Always since I was a kid. Since I was 12 I started working and never stopped. One day I was going to work. I took care of an elderly lady, she was about 80 years old, and I'd sleep over at her place. So in the morning I went to school, in the afternoon I helped my mom with chores at home, and at night I slept at this lady's house. And every day at 15, 16 years old I was on the same route, passing through the same street. On that particular day, I was passing by the street going to sleep at this lady's house. There was a man standing there with flyers in his hand. Just ahead I saw him and looked down, and he was handing out flyers. When I passed this man, he came up to me, introduced himself, right? Said he was a pastor, told me which church he was from. It was a church nearby. I knew the church, right, and handed me a pamphlet. At the time I said to him, "Thank you very much, right? I don't want your pamphlet because I already belong to that church." And I said the name of the church I was at. When I said that to him, this man was amazed. Why? He started walking beside me. He said, "Wow, I was there. I was at that church for 12 years. Today I'm a pastor at this other church." And I walked and he walked next to me and I was all serious, right? I said, "Oh, cool. Oh, have you read that book by so-and-so? Have you done this?" Everything he said I'd already done. And I started listening to him. He walked with me all the way to my work door. He told me his name, right? And he walked and said, "But come to my church sometime to check it out. I'm single." This man would become my ex-husband, right? And I was so reluctant, right? Because I thought, I've never seen him in my life, I'll find out if he's really a pastor, cool. But when I got to my work door, he walked with me to the door. He asked me, "Have you read such and such book?" Because people at the church I was at, the leaders, they write a lot of books. So I'd read some, others I hadn't. I told him, "No." He said, "I'll lend it to you. Do you accept?" I said, "Okay." But I didn't even think he'd actually lend it. "Cool." He said, "Where do you live? I'll drop it off." And I said it innocently, right? "Oh, I live at such and such place." I said, "Look, forgive me, I'm late, I'm going to work, okay?" I went into my job, I slept at that lady's house. The next morning I went to school. From school I went home for lunch. When I got to my house, my mom came to meet me at the gate with a book in her hand, and she said, "So-and-so, the pastor from that church, came here and left this book for you." And I said, "But wait, what?" She said, "Where do you know this man from?" I said, "Mom, he was on the street evangelizing, right, like we talk about." He was on the street evangelizing, and he said he wanted to lend me the book. She said, "But did you give him the address?" I said, "I did." She said, "Well, he came here, he dropped off the book, and said he's going to marry you." And at the time I said, "What do you mean, Mom?" "He said he's gonna marry you." I opened the book. He wrote a beautiful dedication, right? Super romantic. Said he fell in love with me from the moment he saw me. Detail, he asked my age, right? I was 16, 17 years old. And he was already 25. I know there's a 12-year age difference. He's 12 years older than me. And he wrote a beautiful dedication, in the book. A dedication so, wow, any girl who wanted to marry a pastor like I did and thought that would be the best thing in her life, any girl would be dazzled. And that's okay, right? At that time there weren't a lot of cell phones, right, like you have today. You didn't have this social media thing, so I didn't have a way to call to say thank you. I didn't have a phone, so I didn't have a way to call or anything. I said, "Ah, cool." The day passed, right? That's it. I met him the day before. The next day he comes to my house, leaves the book for me, writes a dedication, and tells my mom he's gonna marry me. The day went by. I had that in my head, right? I went to work. When I'm going to work, who do I run into again? Because he knew I was gonna pass by, right? But this time he wasn't alone. When I saw him, I saw that next to him there was a child, a little girl. And I walked until I got to him, a 1-year and 8-month-old girl walking. I got there and greeted them because I was always very communicative, despite everything I went through. I've always been very communicative. I love talking, I love greeting people, My son, when he goes out with me on the street, even says, "Mom, you're like a politician," because I like to talk, make friends. And I saw him. When I got close, I said, How cute! Whose little girl is this? He said, It's my daughter. She's 1 year and 8 months. I said, Wow, how beautiful. And I was enchanted, you know. I still love kids today. I love them. I love them. I say I was called to take care of kids, I think, because wherever I go, kids make friends with me, I make friends with kids, and I love children. And she came up to me, his daughter, and she hugged my leg, you know? This little girl. I remember it as if it were today, even the clothes she was wearing. He said, It's my daughter. I'm divorced. And that day, the next day, he talked more about himself, right? I got divorced. Her mother abandoned me, she abandoned her. Then he told a very sad story, you know? He told a really sad story. And he said, Her mother abandoned me, right? Her mother betrayed me, left me with her. I lived in that city, and I came here to do God's work. And I brought her with me, and I take care of her alone. And me, in my innocence as a girl, if I were the woman I am today, with the experience I have today, I would never have felt sorry for him because it's not normal, right? A single father. Well, in my head today I think this way because of the traumas I went through. But a man alone, coming from another city 500 kilometers away, with a child 1 year and 8 months old, with a super sad story. Today I don't believe it. I may even be wrong. So he told the saddest story in the world, right, that her mother was worthless, and I believed it. And I thought, wow, but what kind of mother abandons her daughter? That poor girl, right? And the child was beautiful. A beautiful girl, a beautiful mixed-race girl with curly hair, you know? Fell in love. I say I fell in love first with the daughter, then with the father. And then he told this sad story. That here he was having difficulty with her because the church didn't support him, and he was sleeping in like a boarding house, right, with her, and other people lived there too. This on the second day I saw him. And then what did I do, right? Me with my heart the way it is, right? I say I have a very big heart. I told him, Look, if you want, I'll take care of her for you. I felt sorry, you know? And he said, Really? You'd do that? I said, Of course. Then the next day I made an appointment with him. I didn't even tell my mom. Didn't say anything to my mom, didn't say anything. The next day I went to school, I said goodbye to him, said goodbye to her. They walked me to my work door. I went to school. Got home. When I got home I told my mom. I said, Mom, the guy who came here and brought the book. He has a daughter, and I'm gonna take care of her in the afternoon because he has nobody to leave her with. My mom, heart bigger than mine, right? Giant, said, Okay then. So he brought her, right? We'd set it up for him to bring the baby to my house, and she stayed there with us. When she got to my house it was like my parents fell in love with her, you know? Everyone, right? My siblings. Because she came in, she stayed 2 days in a row. On the second day, she was calling my mom, Grandma. And it's hard for me, right, to say all of this. And I had just turned 17 the next week. And she started calling me Mommy, because she was so needy. She was far from her mother, and we thought her mother was worthless. Today you'll find out, right, what really happened. And she called my dad Grandpa. Called my mom Grandma, right? My siblings, uncle and aunt. And she was a child, right? She was 1 year and 8 months old, she was still a baby. And I started taking care of her. And in this care I had with her, she stayed with me in the afternoon. At night he'd preach at the church he was at. And after service he'd pick her up. About 3 days passed, all in less than a week, okay? And after about 3 days he asked me to be his girlfriend and I accepted, right? My dad at the time didn't accept. My dad said, But you. Detail, when he went to drop his daughter off, he talked to my dad, and he told my dad the same sad story he told me, the same story he tells to this day to everyone. He told the sad story of the betrayed husband, the husband abandoned by his wife, The wife who abandoned a baby daughter with him, left with a lover. My dad didn't believe it from the beginning. My dad never believed him. And we at home said to my dad, "No, Dad, what is this?" He suffered. I especially, right? I mean, no, Dad. He suffered. He's a pastor. No. My dad said. Ah, that's good then. My dad. How so? He always, at the beginning, got a little confused about things. But then when the whole family says it, right? Him. Ah, that's fine. But a father is a father, right? I say fathers and mothers have sensors, radar. Less than a week, he asked me to date. I accept against my father's wishes. My dad said, "Look, you're gonna date him, but I don't see a future there." Dad, what's this? He's a really good person. He's taking care of his daughter. Look what a good guy he is. He's taking care of a child alone. He came 500 kilometers to do God's work with his daughter. He's a man of God. This was my speech to my dad. My dad said, "Look, you've already had a problem with your relationship in the past. You left church. Now pay attention." My dad gave me a lot of advice. I said, "No, Dad. It's gonna work out." And I confess I was excited by the fact that he was a pastor. Not because he's handsome, because he's not. He has no beauty. I always looked at it that way. He's not a person of beauty, beautiful. Not that beauty counts, no. But I'm saying it wasn't for beauty, wasn't it? It wasn't because he was intelligent, he wasn't. It was because he's a pastor. Believe it or not. But I was a girl, guys. I looked at the church, I looked at the pastors as the holiest people in the world. I thought the church was a place for saints. That's how I saw the church. So I was a girl, right? And I thought a pastor was a superhero. I looked with that. My eyes shone when they said, "Pastor so-and-so is gonna come here to the city." I was thrilled because I said, "Wow, he's anointed of God. He's sent from God." So that's how I saw it. So I said to my dad, "Dad, he's a pastor. He's a suffering pastor, right? He suffered. He has a daughter, a baby still. I'm dating him, Dad. So it's fine, whatever you say." And my dad, he's that old school style, right? If you're dating, you won't date a long time, you have to get married. So I think it wasn't even 15 days. And my life was becoming crazy. And I didn't pay a lot of attention to him, his behavior, because since his daughter was such a charming child, I got involved with taking care of her. She was calling me mommy, right? And I already had love for her because I say for you to love a person, you don't need time, even more so a child. And she was a charming child, a charming girl, suffering. We looked in her eyes and saw she was a suffering child, you know, from everything that was happening. But she didn't know how to tell the real story. She didn't know either. And everything happened in 30 days, if I'm not mistaken. 35 days. He asked me to be engaged, right? Detail, I went to his church. I left my church where I grew up, where I had a foundation, where my parents still are to this day, right? They're still there today. My siblings are still there today. And I'm saying it this way. I don't see any flaws in the church, right? For me, the defect is in those who run the church. Not everyone, there are serious places. And I left the church and went to his church. This all in 1 month. And he introduced me to his leader at the time here, right? And I didn't have a dark past, although I'd had a boyfriend before, right? I lost my virginity. I didn't get married a virgin. There's all that thing, right? Marry a girl, marry a virgin. There's everything in the church, right? There's that whole issue. Although I may not have been like that, I didn't have a dark past. I was a girl, right? And he wrapped me up and took me to his leader. He introduced me. He said he was gonna marry me. All this in less than a month. His leader accepted me because I didn't have a dark past, right? I said I already worked at my church where I was, that I loved doing God's work and I really loved it. And the pastor accepted me and everything was fine. And as he was involving me, I created trust in him to tell him that I'd been abused. I told my boyfriend, who would then be my ex-husband. And one day I turned 17, right? So I was 17 years old, and I had a bit of a panic attack that I always had when I had nightmares. Remember I said it back there. I had many nightmares, so I'd wake up feeling really bad. And that day I remember I woke up very bad, and I met him later. Detail: we didn't sleep together before the wedding, right? I did everything right because he was a pastor, right? Thought so, right? And I was a girl too. So I told him, look, I had a nightmare. And he started involving me, right? What happened? I told him the nightmare. But why? And he was involving me until I said that I'd suffered abuse as a child. And I told him, since he was a pastor, I thought, he'll be able to help me. Because I was abused, and I told him. And he hugged me that day, you know. Cried a lot. It was very difficult to tell this secret, because I'd carried it many years. Imagine from 3 or 4 years old until 17. And I spilled this secret to him. It was in the afternoon, if I'm not mistaken, at night. And he said, I'm with you. I'm gonna help you. I'll take care of you. And he asked me for details of the abuse. I told him all the details. I'd never told anyone. And he said, I'll help you. I'm with you. Everything's fine. I felt welcomed, you know? 'Cause he has a way with words. He knows to this day how to talk. If you see him, talk to him, you'll say, Anna is crazy. This man is a man of God. So he knows how to talk. He involved me. He said, look, your secret is safe with me. Okay. He left, went back to church, went home. The next day, in fact, I went to work, right? I went to sleep at the lady's house. I took his daughter. I already took her with me everywhere. I already took care of her. I was already her mother. And I went to school that day. I didn't go to school, right? I took her to my house and went to school. When I came back from school, he was there at my house at lunchtime. Then he started visiting my house, right? He'd come for lunch, he'd come for dinner, because my parents went through a very difficult financial period right at that time. Before going to church, even in church, they still had a very difficult phase financially. But later things started to get better. Water into wine. Before it was scarcity, then it became a lot of abundance. It's still like that today at my parents' house. You arrive, it's a lot of food. So my dad with food. He never denied it to anyone. He'd never do that. Then he started eating lunch at my house, dinner, right? And always with that sad story, right? The sad father, the abandoned father, the betrayed ex-husband. And that day was the first time, if I'm not mistaken, that he had lunch at my house. I arrived, he was already there. And what did he do? He told my dad and my mom everything I'd been through. The same person who hugged me the night before and said he was gonna protect me, that my secret was safe, because I didn't want to tell. It wasn't the season. And if I had to tell, the one who had to speak had to be me. It was my thing, my life. He went there and told them. He told my parents. When I arrived, my mom, if I'm not mistaken, she was already crying. And my dad asked me and I confirmed it. And it was the only day we talked about that subject. It was that day. And I was very embarrassed, you know? Because I thought, one day maybe I'll tell them, but I didn't want someone else to take my secret, my story, and reveal it like he did, you know? I felt more embarrassed than I'd ever felt. And I remember my dad said, why didn't you say? Why didn't you tell? Then I said, Dad, I was scared. I was ashamed. I was a child. And he was there, right, my parents talking to me, and he stood there looking as if he were the savior, right? In his head he thought, I freed her. I saved her. And on the contrary, I felt embarrassed, you know? He had no right to expose my secret. He had no right to do this. So I was very upset. And cool time passed. My mom was very upset at the time with that, right? My dad tried to find out who it was. I didn't know how to explain, and it was just that day we talked about the subject, and then we put a stone on it and life goes on, right? I didn't want to talk about it anymore. Nowadays I already talk about it because I feel free from all this trauma. Even though I still feel if I close my eyes I remember everything that happened. The feeling I had, my fear was so great, at the time of abuse that this fear I still feel. Remember. But nowadays I speak openly because of this. I've already managed to help other people who suffered abuse. But he didn't have the right to tell a secret that was mine. I think I would have told them later. But that's okay. Past. I kept questioning him. I said, but why did you say it? He said, I wanted to help you. I'm gonna help you all your life. What am I gonna do, help you? And he hugged me, So he's cynical, I didn't know at the time. Today I know. He's like that, he's cold, right? He's disguised. Then he hugged me. I'll take care of you. That's why I told you. You need it. When you marry me. We were already engaged if I'm not mistaken, he said. When you marry me, I need you to be free because you're gonna be the pastor's wife. So you have to be free from trauma, free from fears. So I just wanted to help you. He said that to me. That day I felt really bad, But later, since I was this innocent girl, right, 17 years old, today my son is 17 years old. I look at him these days and I said, wow, how is it possible? When I was 17 years old, I got married. My son, I look at him today. He's the same build I had. I didn't have maturity. And so he involved me, I'll take care of you so you can marry me. You need to be prepared, because you're gonna be the pastor's wife. Is that okay? So I forgave him. I said, he wanted the best for me. I really needed to tell this secret. I'm wrong. Then it began that day, a month into our relationship, a month or so, right, of engagement. On the other hand, manipulation began, and I didn't even notice. In truth, it started when he wanted me to get involved taking care of his daughter, right? But I did it with a lot of love. But I didn't understand the manipulation he was doing, right? There began my story of terror. So we got engaged, right? And my dad said, so you guys hurry up and get married. I'll have your wedding party. Do you want to marry him? I do. Because I was amazed, right? I would be like he told me, right? I was gonna be the pastor's wife. So I wanted to get married as soon as possible because my dream was gonna come true. I thought, wow, it's gonna be so good, right? I'll do God's work. But I looked at everything very innocently. I was very innocent, very, very much so. And I said, I'm gonna do God's work. Wow, I'll help people. What a dream I'm living. My dad said, so I'm gonna arrange your wedding. I'll throw your party. And my dad did. Another thing, before, right, when I told you, he said he told my parents because I was sorry for my father, I had to forgive and everything, but I'd already forgiven, right? So the period that I left home when I was 15, when I came home, I had a little more understanding. I'd already granted forgiveness to my father. I understood my dad wasn't guilty, right? And today I see this, right? So I thought, now for me to enter the work, I have to be really free, right? I have to forgive. I have to throw myself in head first, right? I'm gonna do God's work. I'm gonna win souls. Which was what he said, right? We'll win souls. All right. 3 months then, my dad said, right, I'll do your wedding, your party. And my parents didn't have much money, but it was better than before. My dad threw a party within his means, right? It was very simple, but it was very good for his family. I only met his mother and father on the wedding day because they lived in that city, right in the country in rural Tennessee. And I only met them on the wedding day. His sisters. I only met two of them that day of the wedding. The day his father came for the wedding, I looked at his father and said, "This guy is strange." You know, I don't know how to explain. This guy is strange. And yes, his father arrived here complaining. I didn't even know. His father complained about the party. His father complained about the food. His father complained because he had to stay at my house, right, my parents' house, complaining. Not his mother. His mother's an excellent person. I say that even today, right? Of all the years I lived with him, which were almost 18 years total, I have nothing to say about his mother. On the contrary, she's a suffering person because of her husband, because the husband is worse than the son. So his father complained, right? His mom loved everything, and I took her to the house I was gonna live in. We bought things, right, for the house. I worked. I earned very little. And there was one thing I didn't pay attention to when I was gonna get married, which I think is the main thing. Today I see. I'm now 37 years old, Maine. He didn't work, saying that, right? How can I say it? He only lived off the church. And I didn't realize, when you're so dazzled by the thing that was the whole point. And I think it was at this point my dad wanted to push harder, wanted to talk more, but my dad thought, it'll work out. I think that's it, right? I never talked about this with my dad. But he only lived off the church. So the church gave him a living allowance. And during the day he did nothing. When we went to buy things for the wedding, some furniture for the house we were gonna live in, I was already working, right, which I'd worked since I was 12 years old. I helped him buy it. He had a little bit, right, that the church provided. Of course, assistance for him. We bought it. I remember, if I'm not mistaken. He bought it in the name of a church member because his name was dirty. Another thing I didn't notice, right? Pastor with a dirty name. I didn't pay attention. I was in love, right? The danger of passion. I tell my kids today, be careful with passion because passion blinds. And then we bought the furniture and everything. He paid in installments and I started helping to pay, and I gave him the money every month. Then, 6 months after getting married, I found out he wasn't paying. He wasn't paying for that furniture. But that's a topic later on. And then what happened? I, worked, and he came to me and said, "Look, we're gonna get married. But from the moment we get married, you can't work anymore. You'll live only from the work. You'll live only from the church. And I'll support you, right? Support my daughter, right?" Because his daughter was always with me. She grew up with me. Took her. She's my daughter. Today she's 22 years old. She's my daughter. And he said, "Look, I'll support you and you'll do the work." And I thought that was normal because at the church my mom still goes to today, it's like that, the pastors take care of the church. But then I realized there are other ministries that don't. Pastors work, right? Cool. I said, then okay. I said, no, I'm gonna dedicate myself to the max in the work, because as I already said and I repeat, I love the things of God. Well, we got married, right? On the 25th of December, if I'm not mistaken, 2006. No, I don't remember. 2005, I think 2005, December 25th. We got married on Christmas. And it was a party, right? Well, it was simple. My dad did everything with great simplicity and care. But the day before the wedding, something happened that I say was the biggest sign from God for me to disappear. And I didn't notice. The day before the wedding, he and I were preparing, right? And he, as I said, always very engaging, very affectionate, even suffocating, right? The affection, that thing, that love, that passion. And one day before the wedding, me and him went to a friend's house, right, of his, from the church, from a member, to get something borrowed. I don't remember what it was, but we were going. And along the way, a church member passed. His church, which I was also part of, and greeted him and greeted me. So I said, "Hi." Because as I told you, I'm communicative. I'm Anna. Communicative. You can't hide it. And he greeted me. "Hi, Pastor." And I greeted him. And I said, "Hi." In that hello I said to this boy, when I looked ahead, my ex-husband, he slapped me. I was dizzy, you know? You know when it's something so unexpected. And at the time I was in shock. One day was missing, the day before the wedding. He gave me a slap and I turned back, right? I got kind of dizzy and I looked at him. I thought it was an accident, something, because there was no logic. And I turned back. He slapped me again so hard I fell to the side and came back. And yes, right. Think what happened here. You know, like an accident. I don't know. I'll turn back. He's looking at me with glassy eyes and said to me, "Never again, as long as you live and are by my side, you don't greet another man like that," smiling. Guys, that made me cry. And it made me cry because I didn't understand what was happening. The wedding was on Saturday. That was on a Friday. And I started sobbing. And he said, You are thinking you are what? You are my bride. We're getting married tomorrow. How can you say goodbye to another man?" I said, "No, but I just said goodbye to him. You never again, while you live, you don't greet another man like this. You were insinuating yourself to him." And guys, he tore into me and he spoke to me so much that day, so much so. My face burned and I needed to stop crying. Because how was I gonna go back home, right? I still lived with my parents. If my dad saw me crying, I'm sure my dad would never let me marry him. And I needed to calm down. And I started breathing and I tried to calm down. And the more I tried to calm down, the more nervous I got. And I cried and he cursed me, called me a slut. "You are a slut." And then, I said, "Guys, what do I do?" And then it came into my head. Apologize to him. That's when I said, "I'm sorry, love." Oh guys, I even hear myself saying that today. I don't believe it, what I did. "I'm sorry, love." When I said that, he calmed down, That monster he'd transformed into calmed down. Then he came up to me, he hugged me, Then he said, "I forgive you." And then I started crying even more, right? I said, "I'm sorry. I'll never do this again. Never again will I look at another man." And he convinced me that I was wrong, Today I realize this. I say, guys, how is it possible? I get angry at myself because that day I remember the feeling. I thought, I'm wrong. And I thought, wow, how could I, do that to him? Greet someone. I felt, and so he hugged me and he calmed me down and he ran his hand through my hair, My hair was long and he ran his hand through it and he said, "No, my love. You can stay calm. Forgive you. All I wanted was to hear you apologize." And I hugged him. "Please forgive me. You're the man of my life. It's with you I want to get married." And I thought, guys, I can't lose him. He's a pastor. Then he said to me, "Look, I was hot-headed. I'm not violent. I'd never do that to you. No, I forgive you." And so on. Then he calmed me down, It was something so sick that I didn't notice at the time. And so he calmed me down, right? If I were today's Anna, I would have called the cops on him, He slapped me in the face the day before the wedding. And so he calmed down. I stopped crying, right? And I stopped sobbing and went home. I remember when I entered the house, when he dropped me off at my door. He said to me, "Come in and go straight to your room so your dad and your mom won't see you were crying." And so I did. I entered the house. I went straight to my room, right? My mom. Everything okay? I said, okay, Mom. To work. We got things at so-and-so's house. And my mom. Aren't you gonna have dinner? I said, no, Mom. I don't want it, right? No, I didn't want it. How was I gonna say? Imagine coming to my dad and saying, Dad, the pastor, right, like that? And guys, today I see I was never in love with him. I never was. I was in love with the work. I wanted to get married because I wanted to serve God. So my passion was for God but not for him. I didn't feel that, that desire, that attraction. Maybe you can even judge me, say, wow, but you used him? No, I was this girl, I wanted to do the work. I loved the things of God. I loved taking care of church and I said, love is like that, I didn't think so, my girl head, no. I said, love comes with time, right? And it wasn't like that passion on my part was. And for his daughter, yes. I loved that beautiful child. She'd already arrived calling me Mommy. I hugged her, right? To this day I've never let go again. Oh. The next day was the wedding, right? We got married. It was a party like I already said, simple. My dad did everything as much as he could, right? Everything within the plan. And we got married. And cool, the honeymoon came. Oh, what I thought couldn't get any worse, right? 'Cause he slapped me in the face yesterday. Today he's my husband. Now it's honey, right? Come on, let's see what's gonna happen, right? Since I'd already had a boyfriend before, I wasn't a virgin, but I already knew some things, right? Not a lot, but I knew some things. And guys, on the honeymoon it was terrible. It was horrible, On the honeymoon I discovered what premature ejaculation was. I don't even know if I can say this here, but he had it, right? He has this problem of premature ejaculation. And the honeymoon, it didn't really happen. It was a bit of a weird thing, So I had no experience. For me everything was normal. But then we stayed there in bed. He left the room and went to the bathroom. And in the bathroom he stayed for a long time and I didn't care, right? Got up. Our daughter, which I call our daughter, right? She'd already moved in with us, his daughter, right? She'd already moved in. Got up. I went to her little room. I looked to see if she was sleeping. She was, right? And everything was fine. I covered her, went back to the bedroom, and he was in the bathroom. And he was in the bathroom. Cell phones had already been launched at that time, right? He already had a cell phone. Not the latest generation, but he already had one. In the bathroom he stayed there for a while, left, came back, slept. On the second day of the wedding, right? This was on the honeymoon. Then the next day we moved to another city that's nearby. The church he was being transferred to. And detail. I couldn't work anymore because now I was the pastor's wife. So I moved to another city nearby, right? I left. It was the first time I left close to my mom like this, right? My parents, that I went to another city. And I was very happy, It was a tiny church, but the people were very loving. So they welcomed me very well, And they welcomed my daughter very well. I say, my daughter is his daughter, right? And they received us. We were very happy, Tiny church. And I remember I went in there and said, wow, my dream came true. I'm gonna take care of a church. I'm gonna take care of people. So always with that innocence, First love, right? Those who are evangelical, you know that term, right? First love, that beautiful thing. The work is fascinating, right? And the tiny church, our home neat. The church provided everything. Guys, it was about taking care of people, right? And so, on the third day of marriage, my life had already started to turn into hell. Then that slap that shouldn't have even happened, that I could have stopped. But I didn't know what was coming. From that stage came much worse things. On the third day of marriage he woke up, he was sleeping, and sex, right, it was always like that, 3 seconds. And for me, I couldn't say anything because for me it was normal. I didn't have many experiences. I'd had a boyfriend, and so the sex ended. He went to the bathroom and stayed until I fell asleep. I don't even remember. It was always like that. So during the first year I didn't pay attention to that. My business was taking care of the church, it was his daughter. I was in love, right? It was an open heart, right? And I thought everything was fine. And already on the third day, he woke me up at 3 a.m. dawn and he said, "Get up. Let's pray. Get up, get up. Let's pray." And I said, "But I'm sleepy." I was sleeping. I love sleeping to this day. "Get up. You're gonna pray. Put on some clothes and we'll go down to the church." And the church from our house was far away. And we didn't have a car yet. "We'll go. We'll pray. You didn't want to be a pastor's wife." "I did." "Let's go then." I took his daughter, right? It was dawn. I wrapped her in a blanket. She was already almost 2 years old, right? 'Cause I got married in 3 months. Then I wrapped her in a blanket, picked her up, and we went to church and stayed there until dawn. And I got there. I went to pray, right, and so on. I said, that's it, right? Dedication and everything. And then on the 4th day he already held the first service there, and we welcome people very well. And he's always involved with church things. And like this, but preaching with me, but something I couldn't even explain, that possessive thing, right? Today I know what it is. And in church during the service it ended. Then the brothers came to greet us, right? "Look, welcome to the city." Very good. And people, right? I say that all the places I've been, thank God, I was treated very well. And then the brothers came, right, who helped with the church, we talk about workers, right, the assistants, and came to greet me. And a man came and took my hand and said, "Look, you're very welcome." And everything. People, what for? That was on the 4th day of being married, when he already changed. My ex-husband transformed, changed his face, already got rude. And I didn't know what was happening. And we went home without him saying a word. I put my daughter to sleep, right? And I entered the room. When I entered the room, he grabbed my hair here and said, "Now I'm gonna teach you. You're not a slut. Now I'm gonna teach you." Guys, that day he gave me so many punches. He punched me like this, always on this part or here on the belly or on the back, which was where it was impossible to see. And he hit me and he threw me on the bed and he cursed me. He said, "You're a slut. I don't know if you can say that. You like to hold hands with other men." I said, "Guys, but I'm the pastor of the church." And he didn't let me talk, you know? He threw me against the wall. He grabbed my hair and so on, you know? Very violent. It was another person. And I said, "My God, I'm gonna die." Until there was a time when he stopped, you know? He stopped. Then I told him, "I'm sorry." It was always like that, folks. "I'm sorry. I won't do that more." When I said, "I'm sorry," there I realized that from the first slap I said sorry, he stopped. This time he threw me on the bed several times against the wall, punched me, right? And I thought, I'm gonna die here. And our daughter sleeping, right? And he punched me. And then when I said, "I'm sorry," and he stopped, then he started to cry, you know? I stayed kind of like, what's happening here? My God. He started crying and he asked me for forgiveness, that he'd lost his mind, but if I was good he wouldn't do that more, right? And I said, "No, I won't do this more. I won't talk with any man from the church." I was new, right guys? I was 17 years old. So I said, "No, I'm not gonna talk." And he's 12 years older with a sexual problem, right? With premature ejaculation, full of trauma, of real evil, right? So he saw evil in everything because he was bad. And I forgave him. And we hugged and everything. I remember he came at me. You stop wanting to be with me, you know? And that day I felt disgust. I think it was my 4th day of marriage. I felt a disgust I don't know how to explain, you know? He wasn't him. He was someone else. And I felt this deep disgust and I thought, oh my God, what do I have to do now? We slept, right? I woke up bruised. This part here purple. The back part. I woke up sore in the morning, you know? My hair back here I remember very well, some parts he pulled out. And I woke up like, but what happened here? It wasn't even a married week, right? I thought, I can't tell my parents because he's a pastor. I'm not gonna worry them, right? We got married yesterday, basically. And then he woke up as if nothing had happened. He got up and gave me a kiss on the forehead. Good morning, my love. And I looked like, shall we talk? Let's go. Told him. I said, why did you do this to me? Then I lifted my blouse like that, you know? Then he said, because you deserved it. I said, but I didn't do nothing. I just greeted the man. He gave his hand. Said hello. I'm the pastor's wife. Yeah, but I don't want you to talk to any man. And I said to him, look, please don't put your hand on me anymore. Otherwise I'm gonna ask for a divorce. When I said, I'm gonna ask for the divorce, his hand came again, you know, on my face like that. And then I said, he said, nevermore as long as you live, you speak that word divorce. You'll only divorce me if you cheat or if I die. Otherwise, never. He said, that's it for me. You're never gonna divorce me. You know why? Then he got into a part of me, you know, that I don't think anyone should enter, which is holiness. And I said, why? He said, because if you divorce me, you go to hell. Guys, I believed. He said, you go to hell if you divorce me. Because the Bible, he took the Bible, you know? He took the Bible and said, the Bible here says, the wise woman builds her house. The foolish one destroys it. I recorded this verse, guys, that I think I heard when I was 18 years old, that I stayed with him here. You're not being wise. You want to destroy your marriage. You didn't want to be a pastor's wife. You just have to behave. Yeah, just don't be a slut. And I once again felt guilty. Do you believe it or not? I said, no then. And look, another thing, the Bible says that whoever asks for a divorce without there having been adultery, if there was no adultery, there was no betrayal, and you divorced me, you're going to hell. Is that what you want? Not me, right? God forbid, people. I was terrified of hell, right? Of the terror he caused, right? I don't know, I don't want it. So you are mine. You don't have the right to divorce. And then it passed, right? We went on living and he was always in the same style. Then other problems started, right? This with 15 days of marriage already. The chaos was, my life was like that. I went from a girl who lived with her father and mother and 2 siblings, right? Me and my siblings are united to this day, right? My dad regenerated. He was an alcoholic, went to church, God freed him. My mother, right? And my family was beautiful like that, right? I was in a house where I had structure, right? My dad on weekends, he tried so hard to hang out with us, right? So I went from the girl who had everything at home to eat to living with the pigs, right? Same story of the prodigal son, you know? 'Cause my life became hell. It turned into hell in the 15 days of marriage. I think there was a fight for 14 days, you know? Only the first day he didn't, but always fight. And after 15 days of marriage, I remember he arrived. I was finishing lunch, and he needed to have lunch and go back to church. And I got distracted with our daughter. I'll always say our daughter, right? Today she's more mine than his, okay? You'll find out why. And I got distracted. I ended up delaying lunch, and he arrived and turned the pans over like that, you know? And he turned around and said I was good for nothing, that I was useless, you know? That thing. And something else I remember, you know? Keep talking, I remember. He was a sex addict. For 15 days married, he wanted sex. For 15 days I already couldn't take it anymore, you know? Even if it didn't last like that, it did, right? Yes. And then he'd go to the bathroom. I'm just up front. I found out what he was doing in the bathroom. But it was 15 days, you know? And since the day he punched me, that he attacked me, from that day forward I already felt disgust. So think, it was 15 days, right? In fact, it was almost 18 years, right? Feeling that disgust, you know? The abuser who did it with me there in my childhood. That was the feeling I was having in my marriage to a pastor. And I thought, guys, I'm going crazy because he's a pastor. How so? Do I feel disgust with him? It was 15 days. Until one day we fought. That day he arrived and turned the pans over. I told him, I can't stand you anymore either. You look for me every day. He said, the day you don't give it to me, I'll look for it on the street. He said that to me. I said, but what do you mean, look for it on the street? Aren't you a pastor? He said, you don't know anything about life. You don't know anything. You're a fool. And I was scared, you know. I said, wow, but if he cheats on me. Little did I know that if he betrayed me, the words would fall back on him because he was close to, because he said, then I could separate, because he told me the only right a person has to separate is if there was adultery. But that day I was scared, right? I said, no, I'm starting work now. I don't want to separate. And there are the people, there is the church, right? The brothers were all like that. So the people I will always speak. My whole life where I went, despite all the chaos I experienced, God placed angels in my life, you know? 'Cause the people took care of me. I don't know, they didn't know what I was going through, but they took care of me. And I say it's thanks to my mother's prayers. My mom has a lot of faith, so she always prayed for me. And after a month he turned over, right, the stove that day and such. And then once more I said, look, I'm sorry. I'm not gonna delay lunch more. And when I said sorry, he stopped. So I went, I said, so that's it, right? I say sorry, he stops. And then we made up and stuff. And then at 30 days he already had. There'd already been so much fight. He'd already thrown my clothes in the kitchen. And that's how our daughter started to see, you know? And there was a time I regret a lot that I don't know why, you know, I was already over so much stress. Like with 30 days I started to pull away from her, you know? She was a child and I started talking like, why did I go get involved with this? And I had a period that I pulled away from her. But she was a child. She needed me. So I looked and said, God, I'm not gonna make it. This child, she is not mine, but I know she's also in chaos. So I was pulling away emotionally. I stayed like that for a long time. She felt it. She wanted affection because she didn't have a mother close, right? The mother was labeled as a slut, right? And I stayed away like that for 3 months, right, where I couldn't give affection to her because I was so angry about what was happening to me, you know? And in church, when we went to church at night, wow, he was the best man in the world. Who saw that man in church said, I want a man like that. I would have been single at the time and I saw it. He had no beauty, okay? But he had a way with words. So in church he was the pastor. His preaching, the word that he preached was, the guy inside the house, I'd been married for a month, I was already living in hell. Oh. He wouldn't let me sleep. He wanted to have sex every day. Even though he had premature ejaculation. He wanted to extend it in other ways that were disgusting to me, you know? And when I could sleep, he'd wake me up at 3 a.m. to pray, because I had to pray. There were days, there were times when he decided to fast and I had to fast. You're the pastor's wife. What do you mean you're not gonna fast? You will. We'll stay 3 days without eating. And I stayed because I thought, God will bless. And I prayed and said, God, transform him. You, Lord, gave him to me. I said that, I said, transform him, God. The Lord gave me him. I have a daughter and I had the dream of being a mother, I dreamed of being a mother of a boy. I dreamed. And I was praying that day and he said, we're gonna go 3 days without eating, fasting for the people, for me, for the church. He talked about him. He never talked about me. And we stayed 3 days. I didn't eat or drink, And he said, are you gonna handle it? And I was already very weak. You have to endure. If you can't take it, you're possessed. Because this word too I heard a lot. Demonized. And I felt like, guys, is it even possible to be a pastor's wife? Am I serving? Because this man is never happy. And inside the house it was total chaos. He broke things. He threw them. And I started to get reactive too. If he threw a chair from there, I threw another one from here. And I lived like that. And at church it was the couple. Wow, whoever looked said, guys, I wanna be like that couple. When he was gonna preach, he pointed like this. I always sat in the first chair. And when he was gonna preach, give the sermon, he said, my wife, my dignified, wonderful wife, I said, guys, but how is it possible? And me, And at home I was treated like a slut. He called me a slut. At church I was the very dignified pastor's wife. And that was it, Then I had the brilliant idea, What did I think? And it was brilliant indeed because from that came my son. I said, if I give him a child, I think he'll change because we only have one daughter and she's his daughter. One day her mother will appear. In the meantime, almost a year of marriage had passed, Her mother never appeared. I didn't have much contact, but we had a cell phone, but it was, And I was always talking about her mother. Wow, that woman is worthless because she abandoned her. She didn't see her mother for a year. One day in the city we were in, her mother showed up. Then they told him her mother was getting off the bus, and had gone to see the daughter. And then I went with him to the bus station to pick up, our daughter. When I looked at that woman getting off the bus, really, I said, it's not possible that this woman is everything this man says. I saw a finished woman. I saw a woman getting off the bus to see her daughter. A destroyed woman, And I was already destroyed too. And she came up, she hugged her daughter like this. I think it had been a year since they'd seen each other. And it was difficult for her to find out where he was, His family didn't tell her because his family supports him in everything, okay? Everything he does, they support. And when I saw the woman hug her baby, she was already 3 years old. I didn't have a son yet. My dream was to be a mom, Even with all the chaos I was experiencing. And when she hugs her daughter, I said, something's wrong. Because this hug, this crying is not from a woman who abandoned her daughter. This crying, this hug. And him from afar, and me up front, with the baby, her mother. He's watching everything from afar. And I said, guys, this hug, this crying is not from a woman who abandoned her daughter. She hugged her daughter like this, I always get emotional remembering because I am a mother today. I'm a mom like that. And that hug was like such relief. And she hugged her like that. And the baby hugged her. Didn't see her for a year, her mother, and she looked up. That woman looked at me and said, I thank you, okay? Because you're taking care of my daughter. In that moment, when the biological mother of the little girl thanked me, something inside me began to awaken. For the first time in months I saw clarity. That woman wasn't the monster he painted. She was another victim. It still took me years to gather courage, but that encounter planted a seed. I began to realize that I wasn't crazy, I wasn't possessed, I wasn't wrong. I was trapped. Little by little, with the silent help of some sisters from church who started noticing the signs, I was able to make a plan. I saved money in secret. I documented the abuse by photographing the purple marks. And one day, when he left for another one of his ministry trips, I grabbed our son. Yes, I had my boy, and he became my strength, and I went back to my parents' house. My father cried when he saw me. I knew it, he said. I always knew. My mother hugged me without questions, just love. The exit wasn't easy. He tried to manipulate me with scriptures, threatened, persecuted me. But I was no longer alone. My family, true friends, and even my daughter's mother, who became an ally, helped give me strength. Today, at 37 years old, I am free. My son is growing up in a home full of love and respect. My daughter, because she will always be my daughter, lives with me. Her mother and I have a relationship of respect. She was finally able to tell me the truth about what she suffered. I went back to school, and now I work helping other women in domestic violence situations. I still love the things of God, but I learned that the church is the people, not the building or the title. And God never wanted me to live in a personal hell called marriage. The childhood trauma still visits me sometimes, but I'm in therapy. I learned that I'm not to blame, neither for the abuse I suffered as a child, nor for the violence I lived through in marriage. My father, before he passed away, asked me for forgiveness for not insisting more. I forgave him because I understood. Predators like my ex-husband are masters at deceiving. Sometimes I meet young women at church, with that same sparkle in their eyes that I had, dreaming of being pastors' wives. I approach them with kindness and say, look for his character, not just his position. God didn't call you to be a doormat. He called you to be free. Today I know that my value isn't in a title, in a marriage, or in others' approval. It's in who I am. A survivor who became a strong woman, a present mother, and someone who uses her story to light the path for others. And yes, I still believe in love. But now I know that true love never hurts, never humiliates, never imprisons. I'm free. And that's the best part of my story. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button and subscribe to hear more powerful stories of survival and hope. Your support helps us share these important voices. For more incredible stories like this one, click on one of the stories below. You won't believe what happens next.